Once again, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar on behalf of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. I'm Tedeku and I'm going to be your moderator for today. So for the sake of those joining us for the first time, I would like to say a few things about the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory and what we do. Okay, so ACCPA is a research, policy, and advisory think tank that is headquartered here in Accra, Ghana. Of course, you have representatives in Tanzania, DRC, Morocco, Tunisia, Botswana, and Ethiopia as well. We are dedicated to providing unbiased research, policy, and advisory in the Africa-China space. And of course, we create platforms that spark conversation within the Africa-China space. So we serve as a voice for Africa in dealing with China, and we help to give more insight to the public on the current trends in the Africa-China space. We offer advisory services to as well when it comes to key issues in the Africa-China sector. So if you are joining us, you're interested in the kind of work we do, you want to engage us, collaborate, or partner with us, our doors are always open, and in the course of the webinar, I'm going to share my mail with you in the chat box so they can reach out to us. Then we take it from there. Thank you. So this happens to be the second webinar organized by ACCPA this year. And our first webinar was in January, where we had experts engage us as we discussed FOCAC and the BRI, what to expect. So if you're a key follower of the Africa-China relations, you are going to know that this year is going to be a very busy year in the Africa-China space, as you're expected to have our FOCAC in Russia, in Beijing, then a BRI summit in Russia as well. So you can follow us on all social media platforms to get updated on the current trends in the Africa-China relation. So you can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and other social media platforms so that you get updated as to the subsequent webinars you are going to be posting, and also on some of the publications we make on the Africa-China trends. Once again, we are happy to have you all join us for this insightful section, most especially our distinguished speaker who has written extensively about the theme we are having for today, giving us the opportunity to host this webinar so that she can give us more insight and help us clear some misconceptions when it comes to the Africa-China relations. Saying we are privileged to have you join us, can you please say hi to us before we start today's webinar?
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Mercy, for having me today.
Okay, good to have you. Can you please permit me to read a profile of our speaker for today so that we know what she's up to, then we can start our webinar. Okay, so before that, today's webinar is going to be in two sections. We are going to have a presentation from our speaker, then we proceed with the Q&A section, where we are going to engage in question and answer. So in the course of the presentations, if you have any question, you can drop it using the Q&A button. So it's going to be addressed by our speaker. All right, so our speaker for today is Sanne, an academic researcher with a focus on the consequences of China's re-emergence as a global power for Europe. Her main research interests are Chinese economic activities in Africa, the digital Silk Road, and China's position in the fourth industrial revolution, while running business in China from the period of 2006 to 2008, with the aim to study the Chinese business culture from within. Sanne wondered where the factory of the world was getting its resources from and what the implications were for peace and security on the African continent. Consequently, she shifted her focus towards China-African relations. In South Africa, she led and conducted fieldwork in many African countries and regions in China for her work at the Center for Chinese Studies from 2009 to 2011. Some of her researches has been commissioned by Oxfam, the WWF, and the European Commission. Sanne's PhD research from 2004 to 2018 on Chinese and European telecom vendors in Nigeria gave a new insight in the important role of 5G in the global struggle for leadership of the fourth industrial revolution. We are very much privileged to have you with us, Sanne, to take us through a very insightful section. Okay, our audience, We have our speaker Sane, who is all ready. So Sane, your audience, Sane, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercy, for this very nice introduction. Let me share my presentation with you. As I explained, as I told Mercy, it feels a little bit like preaching to the choir today, because I'm quite sure, and I experienced when giving this presentation to a European audience, I'm opening quite a few eyes. Now today, I expect to have mostly an African audience, and I actually hope that I also contribute something to your thinking. Anyways, I'm really looking forward to the discussion and also hear about your experiences. Because in my country, the Netherlands, China is often perceived as one unitary actor in Africa, like as if President Xi Jinping is controlling every economic activity of a Chinese actor in the African continent. And these Chinese activities in Africa are perceived to be quite negative. So when there is an article written about China-Africa, it often includes the words neo-colonialism, corruption, debt trap, hungry for resources, and African agency is hardly ever mentioned. As a China researcher, formerly working for, indeed, the Center for China Studies in South Africa, I indeed conducted fieldwork in quite some African countries, looking at Chinese economic activities and their impact on the host country. And time again, I was astonished by the fact that what I encountered on the ground was so different from the stories that I learned from European news outlets, but also academic articles. I often thought, like, did these authors even visit the African continent? But I learned that it's not always just about having the experience or not, because I actually met a Dutch diplomat at the EU embassy in Kinshasa just before I started my fieldwork there. While living in Kinshasa, he told me a complete different story than I actually encountered when I was doing my fieldwork. This showed me that people's assumptions are so strong that even seeing the reality, they really perceive it differently. So I decided to go back to Europe to share my experiences and try to break through some of these strong assumptions without being naive or blind for the misconduct that is, of course, also happening. But it is not a special trait of Chinese companies in Africa. We all know many examples of misconduct by European firms in Africa. And for a long time, these companies could get away with it. However, since Chinese investors appeared on the African continent, the negotiation position of African leaders dramatically increased. Some African leaders even opened up long-term contracts again for mining and drilling, knowing that they could get better terms when renegotiating these contracts. Political leaders in the West acted as if this increased interest from China was bad news for the African continent, and they stepped into the role of protector against China's neocolonialism. For example, during her visit in 2012 to a couple of African countries, Hillary Clinton was warning about China's exploitation of Africa. And the IMF pressed the DRC to downsize its resource for infrastructure deal that it had agreed with Chinese companies. And of course, most of this protection was done out of self-interest. However, the narrative about African needed to be protected against this China's neocolonialism is pretty dominant. Is a pretty dominant narrative in the West. So during my research, I came across many examples of African agency that shed a very different light on the situation. And in my presentation today, there will be a collection of examples that prove popular assumptions about Chinese dominance, at least in Europe, wrong. Yeah, and like I said before, I hope that these examples are opening some eyes of the audience today. If not, I'm very interested in learning about your experiences in the discussion. And let me start with the first assumption that Chinese products are flooding African markets, and that this is disastrous for the business of local entrepreneurs. Actually, most of the cheap Chinese products sold in Western Africa are actually imported by local business persons. China's economic boom did not only attract Western businesses to China. The beginning of the millennium was a golden time for African traders who bought goods in Guangzhou to sell them at home. Another very popular assumption is that Chinese infrastructure companies win most tenders in Africa because they are the cheapest, and African leaders go for the cheapest option, which is unfortunate, is then the follow-up assumption because because this cheap infrastructure from China doesn't last long. Well, in reality, government officials from the DRC told me while I was doing my research there that they usually choose Chinese infrastructure companies in road and railway tenders, not because they are the cheapest, because often they are not the cheapest, but because they really appreciate the can-do mentality of the Chinese. They had, for example, experience with an Italian company that was supposed to build a railway in quite far away from Kinshasa. It was difficult to get there. The Italians took the project, but then at some point started to complain because they couldn't get the materials there. So they asked the Congolese government to first build a road so that they could get the materials there before they could start their railway project. It took them too long, and at some point they just gave up. A Chinese company took over the project and didn't complain about anything and finished the project on time. The Italians, by the way, they also sued the Congolese government for the losses that they made. Well, in a response, the Congolese government then sued the Italian company for the losses they made, and then the Italians gave up and you never heard from the Italian company anymore. And the same thing happened with a Lebanese, or a similar thing with a Lebanese company that was supposed to build a road. And at some point they came across a mountain and they couldn't find a way to get through or around it. And again, it was another Chinese company that took over this project and finished it within time. So because of this experience, they often choose Chinese companies. And by the way, I was there with a Danish road engineer, and he was also checking the quality of the roads, and he was impressed with the high quality of the Chinese roads. We were there to study the resource for infrastructure deal between the Congolese government and Chinese firms, also referred to as the SICOMI deal. This Dutch diplomat that I shortly mentioned in my introduction from Kinshasa, he told me that the Chinese were fooled by the Congolese because they had no idea how much these roads that the Chinese would build for them are worth. And they also don't know how much the mines that they would give in return to the Chinese, how much they are worth. So they said, the Congolese inevitably, so it was inevitable that the Congolese would come out badly out of the situation. After this conversation, I went to 2 Congolese government organizations tasked with coordinating the infrastructure projects with the Chinese companies. And the officials sitting around the table were all engineers studied in the US or in Europe. And they explained that they know very well the worth of the roads that they asked the Chinese to build for them. But they acknowledged that they indeed lack knowledge about the mining industry. But so did the Chinese. So what they agreed together with the Chinese is that they would hire Australian mining experts to estimate the value of the mines. And then based on these estimations, they built a contract. And actually, the Chinese built the roads that the Congolese requested them to build, and which fitted in exactly with the Congolese plans to improve logistics within the DRC. So again, so this was a very different story from what I heard the diplomat in Kinshasa telling me and what I actually encountered there. But since the official end of the Great War of Africa, so I would say the official end, because we all know, unfortunately, the fighting didn't end. But that was in July 2003. The DRC has received around $400 million a year from donor countries for reconstruction, but they need several billions a year to rebuild. So the government is therefore repeatedly faced with the choice of setting priorities while all critical sectors need more money. They knew they were sitting on top of an enormous wealth of resources, but they didn't have the money or expertise to build the mines themselves. Moreover, the DRC couldn't borrow any more money from traditional donors, because at the time I started my research, they already had a debt of $4 billion, and that was after a cancellation of $7.9 billion by the IMF in 2010. So that is the reason, because why a Congolese delegation went to China to ask if Chinese parties were interested in having a similar resource for infrastructure deal as they had with their neighboring country, Angola. So it was a Congolese initiative, not as what is often assumed in the West, a Chinese initiative. Although imperfect, the deal provided an opportunity for the Congolese government to develop a local mining industry, sell the resources on the global market, and use the money to pay off at least parts of their debts and build up the country. It was their initiative, and the goal was to take fate into their own hands. Then there is the assumption that Africans need to be protected against Chinese infrastructure companies, because Chinese companies do not care about environmental issues or about human rights. And they can just build a road or a railway straight through a forest or through a village. Again, when I was in the DRC and I spoke with different persons, I found out that what the Chinese were actually doing, they did do social impact investments and environmental impact studies before they started the project. Often they let European organizations do this kind of studies. And then with the results of the report, they went to local leaders and then said, okay, either we can go for plan A, straight through the forest or a village. This is how much time it will cost. This are the costs. Or we can go around it. And these are again the implications of going around it. So the decision is really made by local leaders. Then I want to go from the DRC to Ethiopia before I get into this assumption of authoritarianism. The Chinese government helped the Ethiopian government to build its first satellite. This was successfully launched from China in 2019. Before that, Ethiopia had to rely on foreign satellites for weather information that was used for the agricultural sector. And the cost for these foreign services were very high. This first Ethiopia satellite was jointly developed with Chinese and Ethiopian engineers, and the command and control center is in Ethiopia. So although Ethiopia relied heavily on technological support from China for building and launching the satellite, the Ethiopians did acquire more agency. And I think I'm preaching for the choir here, but in European context, I often then also add that, but we also should not forget that Ethiopian engineers are highly skilled. Because much of the software for the world's most famous humanoid, Sophia, was actually developed by robotic engineers from Ethiopia, for example. But then getting to this popular assumption, it is that Chinese government is exporting authoritarianism by exporting its surveillance technology to other autocratic regimes. That's also an argument often used in the West about Chinese telecom investments in Ethiopia. However, Ethiopia does not need China to turn to China for that kind of technology, because the Ethiopian government already bought software from both a German company and an Italian company. The German company is called Finfisher, the Italian company Hacking Team. And a spokesperson from Hacking Team told Human Rights Watch that Hacking Team is not responsible for the way their customers use their products, and that they expect their customers to behave responsibly and within the law as it applies to them. However, if a Chinese company were to react in this way, we would be ready to judge. But as far as I know, the Italian and German governments and the EU have not taken action on the abuse of German and Italian technology by the Ethiopian government, which is actually demonstrated by Human Rights Watch. This example is then not so much about discovering African agency in a deal with Chinese investors, but more about realizing that the fact that a Chinese company, in the case of Ethiopia, ZTE, sells the technology that can be used as a surveillance tool does not automatically mean that the Chinese government is behind this deal, aiming to export its autocratic model. A business deal is often just a business deal. Then going to Sudan. It is widely believed that Chinese firms targeted Sudan, an unstable country with relatively weak institutions, to exploit the oil in the absence of Western powers. However, again, the reality is quite different. When first approached by Bashir's government to invest in oil concessions, the Chinese government actually told them to please ask the American oil company Chevron instead of them. However, Chevron had left Sudan after 18 years of operation in 1992 and was not planning to return. When in 1993, Sudan was placed on the list of state sponsors of terrorism by the US, and the economic sanctions were implemented in 1997, it became clear that other American and European oil concerns would not invest in Sudan in the foreseeable future either. So the Sudanese were left behind with the knowledge that they were sitting on huge oil reserves, but without the expertise and necessary finance to exploit these reserves by themselves. So it was the then Sudanese ambassador to Beijing who did everything in his power to convince the Chinese to invest in the oil sector of Sudan. When he finally succeeded to do so, he became a national hero. And I cannot end this presentation without saying anything about the debt trap diplomacy, probably one of the most famous assumptions about China's control and dominance in Africa. It is widely believed that the Chinese government purposefully lends money to countries that are not creditworthy to get stakes in strategic assets like ports and mines. This is also referred to as the debt trap diplomacy. Professor Deborah Browdigan from Johns Hopkins did a great job explaining that debt trap diplomacy is not more than a very successful meme. The concept could receive so much traction because of a prevailing negative bias towards Chinese economic activities abroad. In fact, China has been a major lender for only 3 low-income African countries that were considered by the IMF to be debt distressed or on the verge of debt distress. Furthermore, Browdigan shows that while Chinese actors have been involved in the construction or operation of 116 overseas ports in 62 countries, only one, that is Hambantota Tota in Sri Lanka, has been cited as an actual instance rather than projected possibility of debt trap diplomacy. She explains that in fact, the situation in Sri Lanka is similar to the situation in Greece. Selling the port was a means to raise money to deal with larger debt problems. It was not an asset seizure because the port was never made collateral for the loans from the China Exim Bank. The money received for granting 85% of the equity stake to the China Harbor Group in 2017 was not used to repay the loans borrowed for the purpose of building and expansion of the port. Instead, it seems to have been used to repay one or more of the then maturing international sovereign bonds. Furthermore, the first two feasibility studies were done by a Canadian and a Danish company, commissioned by the government of Sri Lanka. And this is thus the only case cited as an actual instance of the debt trap. Still, this idea of debt trap is often used also when it's about Chinese economic activities in Africa. It was actually a meme that was born in January 2017 in a think tank in northern India. Then hardly anyone noticed about it, but two Harvard University graduate students referred to it in a paper. And this student paper was then enthusiastically cited by The Guardian and New York Times and other major media outlets as academic proof of China's intentions. So coming back to what I said in the beginning, when I started this research in 2009, I was surprised to find out how different the reality on the ground was from everything that I read about China's economic activities in Africa. And I'm actually still surprised when I'm in a room with senior government officials and I hear them repeating these stories that are have been debunked by influential researchers like Deborah Brautigam. So why is this the case? I think on the one hand, cognitive dissonance is very strong. People hear and remember mostly what they want to hear. And then people tend to perceive others to be as trustworthy as they are. We all know the history of European colonialism in Africa, and I guess that the idea is, why would the Chinese be different? But last and certainly not least, the African continent and its resources are of huge importance for technological, economic, and military strength. So some global powers go far to keep or get access to this, all in their own ways. And I do hope that the diversification of interested players makes it easier for African host countries to leverage their power for the future of their respective countries. I aim to make a humble contribution to increase the understanding in Europe about Chinese intentions and actions on the African continent. At the same time, hold up a mirror to my fellow Europeans about the behavior of our own companies, and explain that the solution for limiting the power of China, and for that matter, Russia and the US, on the African continent is to increase African agency. Thank you. These are I could give many more examples, but you gave me about 20 minutes for an introduction. I'm very curious about your questions and your experiences. So, Mercy, over to you.
All right, hello. I think that was a very great presentation there where a lot of misconceptions have been cleared. Because Africans' continuous engagement with China when it comes to infrastructure, trade, education, climate change, and what have you, has indeed sparked a lot of misconceptions that is trying to help and also help some of the relationship we have with China. So I think it's time for a question and answer. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop it using the Q&A section. It's going to be addressed in due time. So we have a few questions here, which I'm going to read out to our speaker, then she's going to address them for us. So we have a question here from Josh Carter. He's like, why do you think the Sino-African relation is mostly misconstrued in the policy space in Europe and widely in the West? Is it a deliberate attempt to distort the true story, or it's lack of knowledge on their part? Okay, so do you get a question?
Yes, thank you. I can imagine that this question was posed before the end of my presentation. So towards the end, I actually gave three possible answers. So one would be cognitive dissonance. If you have a certain idea in your mind that this is the truth, you tend to see reality through that glass, through that lens, and then you see constantly proof around you. So that could be one of them. And the other one can be you trust others the way how trust I would say to be similar to you. And unfortunately, we have quite a bad historical reputation. So it could be that Europeans expect Chinese to behave very similar as Europeans have been behaving. And the other one is on purpose. So then seeing it really as competition for the strategic resources that are necessary for becoming or staying the technological leader. So I think it's part of a combination of these three. Yeah, that will be my answer.
Okay, that was great, I think. So there's another question that is, what can be done when it comes to fostering a greater understanding of the relationship between Africa and China and clearing some of this misconception? What do you think are some of the things you can put in place to clear some of these misconceptions and foster a mutual relationship between Africa and China?
I think I think every effort to share these other perspectives contributes to this, but it is you need a lot of endurance because the assumptions are strong. So just like the debt trap, the diplomacy meme has won in popularity, just it has been repeated very often. I think that's what this other perspective needs as well, repetition in as many fora as possible.
Okay. Okay, so since I think someone is asking if there are any specific challenges or obstacles that Africa faces in fully exerting its agency within the context of Sino-African relations. Are there any specific challenges or obstacles that Africa faces in fully exerting its agency within the context of Sino-African relations?
Can you please repeat that one?
Like she's asking if there are any specific challenges or obstacles that African faces in fully exerting its agency within the context of Sino-African relations. Do you get it now?
I think they're not specific. What I think changed because Chinese investors became more active on the African continent is that it created alternatives. So it could have been any other country than China, but it should, of course, any other country with a big bag of money could have been this change and could have created more space for African agency. And I do not think that there is a specific advantage or possibility for African agency in the relationship with China. except for if you compare it with the European relationship, of course, is that there is not this colonial history that shapes the relationship. That makes, yeah, that creates more space, I think.
Okay, so we'd like to know if there are any ways that Africa's agency in Sino-African relation can be further strengthened or empowered. Are there any particular ways or measures you think you can put in place to empower and strengthen Africa's relation in dealing with China?
On the one hand, by realizing that you have this kind of agency, and I think also for different parts in African society, if African civil society knows that Chinese infrastructure companies present the different options to their leaders, either go straight through a forest or around it, then, and that it's not the case what their Western partners perhaps tell them, that the Chinese decided that this road had to go through your village or through the forest, then you know that your agency is actually, as an African civil society organization, is with your leadership. So you don't have to bring it up against the Chinese, which would be more difficult, I guess. So I think knowing who makes the decisions, enlarge the agency of different parts of African society.
Okay, so I think it's Adina, yes, is asking a question pertaining to FOCAC. She's asking, what is the contribution of FOCAC to African students in China? Is there any contribution that FOCAC is making to help African students in China? This is a little bit different from the topic for today. Sure.
So if FOCAC is helping also Africans to go to China, is that what the question was?
What is the contribution of FOCAC to African students in China?
So FOCAC is much more than the triannual meetings that are either in China or in one of the African countries. Through the year, there are specific meetings either in China or in an African country where either academics come together or lawyers come together or any sector from society comes together and to discuss the challenges that both China and African countries are facing, where it's a platform where people can share their experiences, their best practices, and can learn from each other. What can be good about FOCAC as well is that if you are regionally well organized, either via the African Union or via the regional organizations, you can approach China as a group of countries instead of bilaterally, which makes you a stronger negotiation partner.
Okay, so Michael Ben is asking, I think this one is more focused on Ghana, but if you make a general question, is asking, how can Africa leverage the influence of China for Africa's global advancement and its impact on Africa's foreign policy? So it was Ghana specific. How can Ghana leverage the influence of China for Ghana's global advancement and its impact on Ghana's foreign policy?
So first, knowing that you are not dependent on formerly, I'm not very sure about Ghana, but I know that in quite a few African countries, formerly they were quite dependent on investors and help from their former colonial power, which was of course quite sensitive and difficult in many different ways, so that then you already have this very imbalanced relationship. Knowing that there is another country with a big bag of money that is interested in investing, and also European countries can, of course, would be less competitive against each other. And here you have a new country um, with a different approach. And in a way, I find it a little bit difficult because in a way, I want to say that the Chinese are more eye to eye than traditional donors and investors, but not perfectly balanced eye to eye. But already by being more eye to eye, they serve as an example for the traditional investors and donors to invest more in the relationship, to be better. So every time you notice something that the Chinese are doing better than the Europeans or the US, use that in your negotiations with your other partners, because they are very sensitive to that. They are absolutely willing to change their behavior if they know that the Chinese are doing better.
Okay. I think that was well explained and clear enough. So given China's global rise now as a global power, what do you think are some of the lessons that African governments and policymakers can draw from China's own development experience?
One of them is that China only opened up its market for companies that they needed at that time, and that they opened it in a very restrictive way. So European partners tend to tell their African partners that in order to develop, in order to prosper, you need to do two things. You need to have liberal democracy and you need to have a liberal market. But a liberal market only works in your benefit if your companies can compete with any other foreign company in the world. If your national companies cannot compete with foreign companies, a liberal open market is not what you need. So what the Chinese did in a very clever way, they opened up those parts of their market that they needed foreign technology. And then in such a way that as a foreign company, you could only start a business in China with a minority, with a joint venture with a Chinese company, and you could only have a minority share in that joint venture. In that sense, they forced foreign companies to share their technology. And every time they managed to copy or to learn or to develop that technology themselves, even if it was a very small part of the technology, they made a new rule that that part of the technology was no longer allowed to be imported from abroad. That technology could only be bought from local companies. And that's how they increased their competitiveness. I think that's a nice lesson to learn from how China did it.
Okay. Okay, so Josh is asking, what must Africa do differently going forward to avoid mistakes that happened in the past when dealing with different countries?
I find that a very broad question, and I realize I find it difficult to answer. Because it was not always the case that Africans made the wrong choices, it was also the case that they didn't have much of a choice. So I think that makes this situation already very different from the past. But then I think the main lesson to learn is please see that you have the choice right now. And because I can also imagine if that was the past for such a long time that you kind of hang in there a bit, like we don't have a choice, but you absolutely have a choice, and you are the continent that is it's scary and powerful at the same time. Everyone needs you for the green transition, for technological leadership. Everyone needs you. If you realize that, and if you manage to cooperate regionally, no one could go behind your back anymore or around you.
Okay. Because I think when it comes to the issue of the debt trap diplomacy, when it comes to that particular myth, can you throw more light on that and help us understand what other multifaceted factors should be taken into account when analyzing African debt landscape and considering China as leading them into debt trap diplomacy? Can you give us other factors that we can consider before we can go in and say that China is the one leading Africans into debt trap?
Yes, so the US and European countries do everything to put China in a bad light. So this is a way that they do that. And it's a relatively easy one because yes, African countries borrow money, and yes, Chinese get access to mines. So it's often quite easy to make that link, like because these countries are in debt stress, now the only thing they could do was to give away their mines, and that has been the plan from the start from the Chinese. While every single project that has been labeled a debt trap, Professor Deborah Broutingham looked into them. You can also check her website. I think a port in Kenya was also labeled as debt trap. He is in detail explaining why this is not the case. Often because from the start, it was not a Chinese project. Other foreign companies were involved, and Chinese companies took over the project. For us, it is still a very a difficult part, and I have to look further into this to give a very. I would like to get in contact to discuss this point longer. I find it difficult to give a very short answer to this.
Okay. All right, I think we'll be ending our webinar soon. That was a very great and insightful delivery there. A lot of misconception cleared when it comes to China's engagement with Africa, where we say China is taking Africa into debt traps when it comes to resource exploitation and other myths surrounding African-China relations. I think a lot of misconceptions have been cleared and more insights has been given. So at this point, we'd like to ask for your final words before we end the webinar. Sure.
Oh, thank you for giving me the final floor. I've said already so much, so I don't know what to. And to be honest, thank you very much for your attention and for your great questions. And I wish I can stay in contact and discuss longer with you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Very well explained. Okay, so also we've come to the end of today's webinar, and I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest speaker, Sanne, and to you, our dedicated attendees. It's good to have you all join us for such an insightful section. So this webinar has been recorded and is going to be on our YouTube page. You can always go there to access it for further insights. And you can also follow ACCPA on all social media platforms at the Africa-China Center to get more insight on the current trends in the Africa-China space. Also, we are open to partnership, collaboration, and if you want to engage us, our doors are always open. You can always reach out to us via my email that has been shared in the chat box so that we'll take it from there. You can also stay connected with our speaker on LinkedIn at Sanne van der Lugt so that you can always engage here as well. So without much ado, I'd like to say a very big thank you to you once again. Thank you all for joining. And if you have any further questions, you can reach out to me as well via the email and we are going to address it. Okay, I'd like to ask for the permission to end the webinar here. We are so grateful to you all for joining. So once again, thank you and see you next time as you're going to go to our subsequent webinars as well. Thank you so much and bye for now.